Rosa's cruel laughter echoed through the mansion as she towered over the pregnant woman. "You think crying will save you now?" she sneered, her voice dripping with malice. Emma, tears streaming down her face, whispered desperately, "Please, I'm begging you, just leave me alone." The sound of a car door slamming outside made Rosa's expression freeze. What happened next would change everything forever. The gravel crunched beneath David Whitfield's Italian leather shoes as he stepped out of the black sedan, exhaustion weighing heavy on his shoulders after 3 weeks of relentless business meetings across Europe. The familiar sight of his Georgian mansion should have brought comfort, but something felt wrong in the late afternoon silence. No warm lights welcomed him home, no sounds of life echoed from within the grand stone walls that had sheltered 3 generations of his family. The house stood like a beautiful tomb against the darkening sky, its windows reflecting nothing but emptiness back at him. As David climbed the marble steps to the front door, a sound stopped him cold. It was faint, barely audible through the thick walls, but unmistakable. Someone was crying. Not just crying, but sobbing with the kind of desperation that comes from complete helplessness. His heart hammered against his ribs as he fumbled with his keys, the sound growing clearer as he pushed open the heavy oak door. The crying was coming from upstairs, mixed with another voice that made his blood freeze. Rosa's laughter echoed through the mansion as she towered over the pregnant woman. "You think crying will save you now?" she sneered, her voice dripping with malice that David had never heard before. Emma, tears streaming down her face, whispered desperately, "Please, I'm begging you, just leave me alone." The sound of David's car door slamming outside made Rosa's expression freeze, but it was too late. He was already taking the stairs 3 at a time, his business briefcase forgotten on the marble floor below. David burst through the bathroom door to find Emma, his late wife's younger sister, pressed against the wall with her hands protectively cradling her rounded belly. Her face was streaked with tears and something that looked like fear, raw, primal terror that no pregnant woman should ever have to experience. Rosa stood over her, a bucket of dirty mop water in her hands, positioned as if she had been about to pour it over Emma's head. The shock on Rosa's face lasted only a moment before it transformed into something David didn't recognize, a cold calculation that chilled him to the bone. "Mr. Whitfield," Rosa said smoothly, setting the bucket down with practiced ease. "I was just cleaning up a mess that Emma made. She's been so clumsy lately with her condition." But David's eyes took in the scene before him. Emma's trembling form, the defensive way she held herself, the cruel satisfaction that had been on Rosa's face just moments before. For the first time since his wife Sarah's passing, David felt something other than grief. He felt rage, pure and burning, at what had been happening in his own home while he'd been drowning in work and sorrow. "Stop!" David's voice cut through the air like a blade, and in that single word, the balance of power in the house shifted forever. Emma's sobs quieted to shaky breaths as she looked at him with desperate hope, while Rosa's mask of servitude finally began to slip, revealing something much darker underneath. 2 years had passed since Sarah's sudden departure from their lives. 2 years since David Whitfield had transformed from a devoted husband into a hollow shell of success. The tech empire he'd built from nothing continued to flourish under his relentless drive, but every achievement felt meaningless without Sarah's proud smile to share it with. He'd thrown himself into mergers and acquisitions, international expansions and boardroom battles, anything to escape the suffocating silence of their home, where her laughter once filled every corner. The irony wasn't lost on him that in trying to outrun grief, he'd abandoned the very people Sarah had loved most. Emma had moved into the mansion 6 months ago when complications with her pregnancy required bed rest and constant care. Sarah's younger sister carried not just new life, but the memory of weekend dinners and holiday celebrations when the house buzzed with family warmth. Her husband deployed overseas, Emma had nowhere else to turn, and David couldn't bear to say no to the woman who reminded him so much of his beloved wife. She brought with her the same gentle spirit and infectious laugh, though lately, David realized with growing shame, he'd barely noticed whether she was laughing at all. Rosa Delgado had appeared in their lives like an answer to prayers during Sarah's final months. When caring for a terminally ill wife while running a multinational corporation had nearly broken David's sanity. She came with impeccable references, spoke fluent English despite her thick accent, and demonstrated an uncanny ability to anticipate every household need before it arose. Sarah had trusted her completely, often joking that Rosa knew the house better than they did. After Sarah's passing, Rosa had seamlessly stepped into the void, managing everything from grocery shopping to maintenance schedules, allowing David to lose himself in work without worrying about domestic responsibilities. But Rosa Delgado harbored secrets beneath her mask of devoted service, secrets born from a childhood of poverty in a country where the wealthy lived like gods, while people like her family struggled for scraps. She'd watched her own mother clean the homes of the rich for decades, always grateful for whatever coins they threw her way, never daring to dream of more. Rosa had sworn things would be different for her, that she would take what she deserved rather than beg for it. The Whitfield family represented everything she resented about the world: their casual wealth, their assumption that money could solve any problem, their ability to grieve in luxury while others suffered in silence. When David began traveling more frequently after Sarah's passing, Rosa saw opportunity in his absence. The house became her kingdom, and she ruled it with subtle cruelty that she disguised as efficiency. She began isolating the elderly Whitfield parents in their wing of the house, convincing David that too much activity tired them and that she could better care for their needs. She intercepted phone calls and carefully screened visitors, creating a bubble of control that grew stronger with each passing month. Emma's arrival had threatened that control, representing family bonds that Rosa couldn't manipulate or sever. The pregnant young woman possessed an intuitive kindness that reminded everyone of Sarah, and Rosa recognized the danger immediately. If Emma remained in the house, she might notice the small thefts, the deliberate isolation of the elderly couple, or the gradual way Rosa had been positioning herself as indispensable while systematically undermining family connections. So Rosa had begun her campaign of psychological warfare, using Emma's vulnerable condition and David's absence to create a climate of fear and helplessness that served her growing ambitions perfectly. The hours following David's explosive return home revealed a house of shadows where normalcy had been carefully staged for his benefit. As Rosa retreated to prepare dinner with unsettling composure, David helped Emma to the living room, noticing for the first time how she flinched when footsteps approached too quickly. Her maternity dress, once a cheerful floral pattern that Sarah had picked out during a shopping trip months before her passing, now hung loose on her diminished frame. The robust glow that should have accompanied her advanced pregnancy had been replaced by a pallor that spoke of sleepless nights and constant stress. Emma's hands trembled as she accepted the glass of water David brought her, and he caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. Around her wrist, barely visible beneath her sleeve, was a dark bruise in the unmistakable shape of fingers. When he gently asked about it, Emma's eyes darted toward the kitchen where the sound of Rosa's preparations created an ominous soundtrack to their whispered conversation. "She was carrying groceries, and I slipped," Emma explained, but her voice carried the hollow ring of a rehearsed lie. David felt a crushing weight of guilt settle over him as he realized how many phone calls from home he'd dismissed as unimportant, how many times he'd cut conversations short because business demands seemed more pressing than family concerns. The house itself seemed to whisper secrets that David had been too absent to hear. Picture frames that once held family photos now displayed only formal portraits. The candid shots of laughter and celebration mysteriously disappeared. Sarah's favorite flowers, which had always filled the entrance hall with color and life, had been replaced with stark white lilies that felt more appropriate for a funeral than a home. The temperature throughout the house felt unnaturally cold, as if warmth itself had been systematically eliminated along with joy and comfort. When David ventured to check on his parents in their wing of the mansion, he discovered another layer of Rosa's control that chilled him to the bone. His father, once a vibrant man who had built the family's first successful business with his bare hands, sat hunched in his chair with the defeated posture of someone who had given up fighting. His mother, a woman who had hosted elaborate dinner parties and charitable events for decades, barely looked up when David entered their sitting room. They seemed smaller somehow, diminished not just by age, but by something that had systematically crushed their spirits over months of careful manipulation. "We don't want to be any trouble," his mother whispered, when David asked how they were feeling, her voice carrying an apology that broke his heart. "Rosa takes such good care of everything," his father added quickly. But there was something in his eyes that looked like fear. When David mentioned that he was considering staying home more often, both parents exchanged a glance that spoke volumes about conversations they'd been having in private, discussions about concerns they felt powerless to voice to a son drowning in his own grief. The evening meal that Rosa served was a masterpiece of presentation and passive aggression, each dish prepared to perfection, while the atmosphere grew increasingly suffocating with unspoken tensions. Rosa moved through the dining room with the confidence of someone who knew every secret the house contained, serving each family member while maintaining the facade of devoted service. But David now noticed the way Emma barely touched her food, how his parents kept their eyes downcast, and how Rosa's smile never quite reached her eyes when she thought no one was watching her closely enough to matter. Sleep eluded David that first night home, as fragments of disturbing observations replayed endlessly in his mind. The way Emma had apologized repeatedly for existing, how his parents seemed to shrink into themselves whenever Rosa approached, and, most unsettling of all, the practiced ease with which Rosa had explained away every troubling detail he'd questioned. By dawn, David had made a decision that would change everything. He would stay home indefinitely, claiming a need to reorganize his business priorities while secretly investigating what had transformed his family sanctuary into a prison of fear. The investigation began with Sarah's personal belongings, items that David had been too heartbroken to sort through, but that Rosa had somehow gained access to during his absence. In Sarah's private study, her jewelry box sat nearly empty except for costume pieces, while her grandmother's antique diamond earrings and the sapphire necklace David had given her for their anniversary were nowhere to be found. When he casually asked Rosa about them, she suggested with practiced concern that perhaps Emma had borrowed them, or that David himself had moved them during one of his grief-stricken episodes. The implication that his own memory couldn't be trusted was delivered with such subtle manipulation that David felt both insulted and impressed by her psychological cunning. Emma proved to be a reluctant witness at first, her months of conditioning making her reluctant to speak against the woman who controlled every aspect of daily life in the house. But as David spent more time at home, creating opportunities for private conversations, the truth began to emerge in heartbreaking fragments. Rosa had been withholding Emma's prenatal vitamins unless she completed impossible cleaning tasks while pregnant, had repeatedly suggested that David would be better off without the burden of caring for his late wife's family, and had systematically convinced Emma that any complaints would result in her being thrown out onto the streets with nowhere to go. The elderly Whitfield parents revealed their own nightmare during a carefully orchestrated conversation when Rosa left for grocery shopping. They spoke in whispers, as if the walls themselves might report back to their tormentor, describing months of subtle psychological torture disguised as care. Rosa had been gradually reducing their meals while claiming their appetites were diminishing with age, had convinced their longtime friends that they were too tired for visits, and had taken control of their medications with the excuse that David was too busy to manage such details. Most devastating of all, she had been intercepting their mail and phone calls, isolating them from the outside world while convincing David that they preferred their privacy. David's business acumen, honed by years of detecting corporate fraud and financial manipulation, now turned toward documenting the systematic abuse occurring in his own home. He began photographing Emma's bruises, recording conversations with hidden devices, and maintaining a detailed journal of Rosa's behavior patterns and contradictions in her stories. The woman who had seemed like a godsend during his darkest hours revealed herself to be a predator who had exploited his vulnerability to gain unprecedented access to his family's lives and resources. The breakthrough came when David discovered his father's secret hiding place behind a loose floorboard in the library, where the old man had been documenting Rosa's behavior in shaky handwriting on scraps of paper. The notes painted a picture of escalating control and cruelty that had begun almost immediately after Sarah's passing, but had accelerated dramatically once David started traveling frequently. "Help us," one note read simply, followed by dates and descriptions of incidents that made David's hands shake with rage as he realized how completely he had failed the people who needed him most. David's investigation took a terrifying turn when he discovered Rosa's room while she was out running errands, finding evidence that revealed the true scope of her deception and ambition. Hidden beneath her mattress was a collection of forged documents that made his blood run cold. Legal papers attempting to establish herself as a beneficiary in his will, fake medical records claiming his parents were mentally incompetent and required a legal guardian, and, most chilling of all, adoption papers bearing Emma's forged signature that would give Rosa custody of the unborn child. The documents were sophisticated forgeries that suggested Rosa had been planning this systematic takeover of his family for months, possibly since Sarah's passing. Among Rosa's personal belongings, David found a leather-bound journal written in Spanish that revealed the depth of her resentment and twisted logic. Using his business-level understanding of the language, he translated passages that spoke of wealthy families who deserved to lose everything, of servants who were owed more than gratitude for their sacrifices, and of a grand plan to claim what rightfully belonged to those who actually maintained the household. The journal revealed Rosa's background as the daughter of a domestic worker who had been fired without severance after 20 years of service to a wealthy family, an experience that had poisoned her heart against all employers regardless of their treatment of her. The most disturbing entries detailed Rosa's systematic study of the Whitfield family's vulnerabilities and her calculated exploitation of David's grief. She had researched inheritance laws, studied psychological manipulation techniques, and even contacted other domestic workers who had successfully sued their employers for various claims. One passage described her satisfaction at watching David's parents grow weaker under her care, while another celebrated the way she had convinced Emma that her own clumsiness was responsible for the accidents that kept happening around her. Rosa saw herself not as an abuser, but as someone finally taking what the wealthy owed to people like her. David's discovery of Rosa's true nature coincided with an escalation in her behavior that suggested she sensed his growing awareness of her activities. She began making subtle threats disguised as concerns about family welfare, wondering aloud whether David's stress from work was affecting his judgment about what was best for everyone. She started documenting supposed incidents of David's erratic behavior, creating a paper trail that could be used to question his mental competency if he tried to expose her. The predator was preparing to eliminate the final obstacle to her complete control over the household and its resources. The breaking point came when David caught Rosa attempting to give Emma medication that wasn't prescribed for her pregnancy, claiming it would help with morning sickness that Emma hadn't experienced in months. When David questioned the pills, Rosa's mask slipped completely for the first time, revealing a rage that had been simmering beneath her servile exterior. "You think you're so much better than me?" she snarled, her accent becoming thicker with emotion. "You leave your family like garbage and expect them to be perfect when you return. You don't deserve what you have, and soon you won't have it anymore." That moment of unveiled hatred confirmed David's worst fears about what Rosa was capable of and what she had already done to his family. The woman he had trusted with his most precious relationships had been systematically destroying them while positioning herself to inherit the ruins. The confrontation was inevitable now, but David realized that Rosa's desperation and exposed position made her more dangerous than ever. She had nothing left to lose, and everything to gain by eliminating any witnesses to her crimes, making the next phase of this nightmare potentially deadly for everyone he loved. The house became a battlefield of wills, as David began implementing security measures while maintaining the pretense that nothing had changed. He quietly installed hidden cameras throughout the common areas, contacted his lawyer to secure the family's legal documents, and arranged for a trusted security company to monitor the property without Rosa's knowledge. Every interaction with her became a careful dance of deception, as David gathered evidence while protecting his family from a woman who had revealed herself to be capable of anything. The tension in the air was so thick that even Emma, despite her fragile condition, sensed that something momentous was building toward an inevitable explosion. Rosa, meanwhile, accelerated her timeline as her predatory instincts warned her that her carefully constructed kingdom was under threat. She began working longer hours, claiming increased dedication to the family's welfare, while actually using the extra time to search David's study for evidence of his investigation. She found the hidden cameras within days, confirming her suspicions that her employer had discovered enough to be dangerous. Rather than retreat, Rosa doubled down on her campaign of psychological warfare, convincing herself that a bold offensive was her only chance of maintaining control over the situation she had spent 2 years building. The elderly Whitfield parents became unwilling pawns in an escalating game of chess as Rosa used their dependence on her care as leverage against David's growing resistance. She began administering their medications irregularly, causing confusion and disorientation that she blamed on their advancing age, while suggesting to David that perhaps professional care in a facility would be more appropriate for their declining condition. When David's father tried to speak privately with his son about Rosa's behavior, she interrupted with apparent concern about his increasing confusion and paranoia, a performance so convincing that David struggled to separate truth from manipulation even when he knew her true nature. Emma became the focal point of Rosa's desperation as the pregnancy advanced and the baby's arrival approached, representing both Rosa's ultimate prize and her greatest vulnerability. The forged adoption papers hidden in her room revealed a plan that depended on convincing authorities that Emma was an unfit mother due to drug use, mental instability, or David's failure to provide proper care during her stay in his home. Rosa began planting evidence of these supposed problems, hiding prescription bottles that didn't belong to Emma, and documenting conversations that portrayed her as unstable and dependent. The pregnant woman found herself living in constant fear, unsure which of her words or actions might be twisted into evidence against her fitness as a mother. David's investigation uncovered financial irregularities that revealed the true scope of Rosa's criminal enterprise, extending far beyond household theft. Bank statements showed systematic transfers of small amounts from various family accounts, totaling thousands of dollars over months of careful embezzlement. Credit cards had been opened in the elderly parents' names, with charges for expensive items that never appeared in the house, while Rosa had been selling family heirlooms through online auction sites using fake identities. The financial crimes alone were enough to send her to prison for years, but David realized that exposing her now might trigger a desperate response that could endanger his family's immediate safety. The psychological pressure reached a breaking point when Rosa began hinting that David's frequent absences and workaholic tendencies suggested someone who couldn't properly care for a family, especially with elderly parents and a pregnant relative requiring constant attention. She floated the idea that perhaps she could formalize her role through legal guardianship arrangements that would ensure everyone received proper care, regardless of David's business obligations. The audacity of her suggestion, delivered with the same helpful tone she had used for 2 years, crystallized David's understanding that Rosa saw herself not as a criminal, but as someone righteously claiming what she deserved after years of service to ungrateful employers. The final confrontation erupted on a storm-lashed evening when Rosa made her most dangerous move yet, attempting to convince Emma that David had ordered her removal from the house due to concerns about her mental stability affecting the pregnancy. Rosa had prepared fake documentation supposedly from David's lawyer, complete with official letterhead and legal language suggesting that Emma's presence was creating liability issues for the family. The pregnant woman, already worn down by months of psychological manipulation, broke down in tears as Rosa explained with false sympathy that David simply couldn't risk the complications that Emma's emotional instability might create for his reputation and business interests. David discovered Rosa's latest deception when he found Emma packing her belongings with shaking hands, preparing to leave the only safe haven she had during her vulnerable pregnancy. The sight of his late wife's sister, carrying his future niece or nephew, being driven from their home by lies and manipulation, ignited a protective fury in David that burned away the last vestiges of his grief-induced paralysis. When Emma tearfully showed him the forged documents, David felt something shift fundamentally inside him. The businessman who had been drowning in sorrow transformed into a man who would fight with everything he had to protect his family from this predator who had infiltrated their lives. The confrontation that followed shattered Rosa's carefully maintained facade as David presented her with copies of her forged documents, photographs of the stolen jewelry, and recordings of her threats against Emma. For the first time since entering their home, Rosa found herself completely exposed, with no lies sophisticated enough to explain away the mountain of evidence David had assembled. Her response revealed the depth of her delusion and rage as she screamed about the injustice of wealthy families who lived in luxury, while people like her scraped by on the edges of their prosperity, claiming that everything she had taken was rightfully hers as payment for her sacrifices. In that moment of explosive truth, the family members Rosa had isolated and terrorized found their voices and their courage. Emma stepped forward despite her fear, describing months of subtle cruelty and manipulation that had made her question her own sanity. David's parents, freed from their prison of intimidation, spoke about the systematic way Rosa had cut them off from friends and family while convincing David they preferred isolation. His father produced the hidden notes he had been keeping, evidence of every incident and threat that Rosa had made them endure in silence. The united front of their testimony created an unshakable foundation of truth that no amount of manipulation could undermine. Rosa's final desperate gambit involved threatening to expose supposed secrets about the family's business dealings and David's fitness as a guardian. But her leverage had evaporated along with her credibility. The woman who had controlled every aspect of their daily lives for 2 years suddenly found herself powerless, facing a family that had rediscovered their bonds and their strength through shared adversity. Her threats became increasingly wild and contradictory as she realized that her carefully constructed house of cards was collapsing around her, leaving her with nothing but the consequences of her criminal actions. The transformation in the house was immediate and palpable, as the family members who had been walking on eggshells for months finally felt free to express their relief and support for each other. Emma's tears shifted from fear to gratitude as David assured her that she would always have a home with them, while his parents seemed to grow taller and stronger with each word they spoke against their former tormentor. The mansion that had felt like a tomb began to feel like a home again, as love and truth drove out the shadows that manipulation and fear had cast over every room. Justice arrived with the morning light, as David's legal team, armed with overwhelming evidence of Rosa's crimes, contacted the appropriate authorities to ensure that her systematic abuse would face proper consequences. Detective Maria Santos, a seasoned investigator specializing in domestic fraud cases, reviewed the documentation with the grim efficiency of someone who had seen too many predators exploit vulnerable families. The forged legal documents alone constituted multiple felonies, while the financial crimes David had uncovered painted a picture of calculated theft that had been escalating for months. Rosa's elaborate scheme to gain control of the family's assets and custody of Emma's unborn child represented a level of criminal ambition that shocked even experienced law enforcement professionals. Rosa's arrest occurred with the same dramatic flair that had characterized her entire time in the Whitfield household, though this time the performance worked against her rather than in her favor. When the police arrived to question her about the evidence David had presented, she initially attempted to maintain her facade of devoted service, claiming that any irregularities must be misunderstandings or mistakes made by the grieving family members she had been trying to help. However, when confronted with her own handwritten journal detailing her resentment and plans, Rosa's composure finally shattered completely, revealing the depth of hatred that had motivated her systematic campaign against the family. The legal proceedings that followed exposed Rosa's history of similar crimes against other wealthy families, as investigators discovered a pattern of employment with vulnerable households, followed by escalating theft and manipulation. Two previous employers came forward with stories of missing jewelry, forged documents, and psychological manipulation tactics that matched Rosa's behavior in the Whitfield home exactly. The district attorney's office, recognizing the serious nature of her crimes and the potential danger she posed to other families, pursued the maximum penalties available under the law for her extensive list of charges. Emma's testimony proved to be the most powerful element of the case against Rosa, as the pregnant woman's quiet dignity and obvious trauma illustrated the human cost of Rosa's calculated cruelty. Speaking clearly despite her visible nervousness, Emma described the daily fear and confusion that had become her reality under Rosa's systematic psychological abuse. Her testimony about the attempts to withhold medical care and the threats regarding her unborn child moved even the most hardened courtroom veterans, while Rosa's defense attorney struggled to explain away behavior that seemed designed specifically to harm the most vulnerable member of the household. The elderly Whitfield parents provided testimony that revealed the full scope of Rosa's manipulation and isolation tactics, describing how she had systematically cut them off from friends, family, and medical care, while convincing their son that they preferred their privacy. Their courage in speaking against their former tormentor, despite months of conditioning designed to make them feel powerless, demonstrated the resilience of the human spirit when supported by family love and determination. The judge noted that Rosa's exploitation of elderly victims represented a particularly cruel aspect of her crimes that demanded serious consequences. Rosa's sentencing hearing became a moment of closure for the family, as each member had the opportunity to speak about the impact her crimes had on their lives and their relationships with each other. David spoke about the guilt he carried for allowing his grief to blind him to his family's suffering, while emphasizing that Rosa's actions represented a betrayal of trust that could have had devastating consequences for everyone he loved. The judge's final sentence of 5 years in prison, followed by deportation proceedings, ensured that Rosa would face meaningful consequences for her crimes, while protecting other potential victims from her predatory behavior in the future. The healing process began slowly, like sunlight gradually returning to a house that had been shrouded in darkness for too long. David made the conscious decision to step back from his relentless business schedule, delegating responsibilities to trusted partners and refusing international travel until his family had recovered from their trauma. The mansion that had felt like a prison under Rosa's control gradually transformed back into a home as each family member rediscovered their voice and their place within the protective walls that should have always been their sanctuary. The process wasn't immediate or easy, but it was sustained by the determination of people who had learned the precious value of family bonds through nearly losing them entirely. Emma's pregnancy progressed under proper medical care and emotional support, her health improving dramatically once the constant stress and fear were removed from her daily life. David arranged for the finest prenatal specialists, but more importantly, he ensured that Emma felt valued and protected as she prepared for motherhood. The guest wing of the house was renovated into a comfortable suite where Emma could rest and prepare for her baby's arrival, surrounded by the love and support that Sarah would have insisted upon if she had still been alive to provide it. The healing of Emma's emotional wounds ran parallel to her physical recovery, as she slowly regained confidence in her own judgment and worthiness of care. The elderly Whitfield parents experienced a remarkable revival as their isolation ended and their connection to family and friends was restored. David's father, freed from the medications that Rosa had been manipulating, regained much of his mental clarity and began sharing stories and wisdom that David realized he had been too busy to appreciate during his years of professional obsession. His mother resumed contact with longtime friends and neighbors, hosting small gatherings that filled the house with laughter and conversation for the first time since Sarah's passing. The couple's renewed vitality served as a powerful reminder that proper care means supporting independence and dignity rather than creating dependence and control. David himself underwent the most profound transformation as he confronted the guilt and grief that had made him vulnerable to Rosa's manipulation in the first place. Professional counseling helped him understand how his workaholic tendencies had been an attempt to avoid processing Sarah's loss, inadvertently abandoning the people she had loved most when they needed him most desperately. He began incorporating Sarah's memory into daily life in healthy ways, sharing stories about her with Emma and his parents, and making decisions based on the values and priorities she had tried to instill in him throughout their marriage. The house itself was cleansed and renewed, as the family worked together to remove every trace of Rosa's presence and influence. Sarah's personal belongings were restored to their proper places. Family photographs returned to prominence, and rooms that had been kept cold and formal were warmed with color and comfort once again. David's parents took charge of replanting Sarah's favorite flowers in the garden, creating a living memorial that celebrated life and growth rather than dwelling in sorrow. Emma contributed her own touches, preparing a nursery that honored both her sister's memory and her child's future. As Emma's due date approached, the household buzzed with anticipation and preparation that felt natural and joyful rather than stressful or fearful. David found himself looking forward to becoming an uncle with the same excitement he had once reserved for closing major business deals, while his parents prepared to welcome their first grandchild with the energy and enthusiasm that proper care and family support had restored to their lives. The baby represented not just new life, but the promise of a family that had learned to protect and cherish each other through the darkest of challenges. 2 years later, the Whitfield mansion resonated with the joyful chaos of a family reborn, where laughter echoed through halls that had once known only fear and silence. Little Sarah Grace, named for the aunt she would never meet but whose spirit lived on in every family gathering, toddled through the garden on unsteady legs while her Uncle David and great-grandparents tended the flower beds that bloomed more vibrantly than ever before. The child's presence had brought a healing completeness to their lives, her innocent joy serving as a daily reminder that love perseveres and family bonds can overcome even the darkest challenges when people choose to fight for each other. Emma had blossomed into confident motherhood, her strength and wisdom deepened by the trials she had survived and the support system that now surrounded her unconditionally. She had completed her education through online courses while raising her daughter, preparing for a career in social work that would help other vulnerable families recognize and escape situations similar to what she had endured. Her transformation from victim to advocate demonstrated the power of healing when it occurs within a framework of genuine love and protection, rather than the false security that manipulation and control attempt to provide. David's business empire continued to thrive, but now operated under principles that prioritized family time and personal relationships alongside financial success. He had restructured his company to allow for remote management and flexible scheduling, ensuring that he would never again be absent when his family needed him most. The guilt that had once driven him to workaholic extremes had been replaced by a mature understanding of responsibility that honored both professional commitments and personal relationships. His office at home overlooked the garden where his parents played with their great-granddaughter, providing a constant visual reminder of what truly mattered in life. The elderly Whitfield parents had not only recovered their health and vitality, but had become local advocates for elder abuse awareness, sharing their story with community organizations and law enforcement agencies to help others recognize the warning signs they had missed. Their courage in speaking publicly about their experiences had led to improved training for social workers and healthcare providers, turning their trauma into a force for positive change that protected other vulnerable seniors from similar predators. Their advocacy work had given them renewed purpose and demonstrated that even painful experiences could be transformed into opportunities to serve others. The house itself had become a sanctuary that perfectly balanced remembrance and renewal, where Sarah's memory lived alongside the new traditions that David's growing family created together. Sunday dinners brought together extended family and close friends, filling the dining room with conversations and laughter that Rosa's presence had once suppressed. The mansion's rooms, each restored to warmth and comfort, served their intended purpose of providing shelter and security for people who loved and protected each other unconditionally, regardless of the challenges life might bring. On quiet evenings when little Sarah Grace slept peacefully in her nursery, David often stood in the garden where he had once felt lost in grief, now surrounded by the evidence of how much can be rebuilt when love guides the reconstruction. The flowers his parents tended, the swing he had installed for his niece, and the sense of security that pervaded every corner of their home served as testament to a fundamental truth that no amount of manipulation or cruelty could ultimately destroy. Evil had been punished through justice and accountability. Good had been rewarded through family bonds that grew stronger under pressure, and justice had indeed been built with truth, courage, and the unconditional love that makes families willing to fight for each other no matter the cost. What would you do to protect the most vulnerable in your family? And how far would you go to ensure their safety, dignity, and happiness? See you in the next episode.